Welcome to the sleep haunt. Tonight the open road stretches into shadow, carrying 8 true disturbing trucker horror stories, tales drawn from lonely highways, silent rest stops, and long nights where the dark feels endless. These stories don't rush or shout, they whisper, and their echoes stay with you long after the miles have passed. Stay until the last word, where each story threads into the next, and the final echo lingers like headlights fading in the distance. If nights like this speak to you, be sure to subscribe so you never miss what waits in the dark. And before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And like our video, your like motivates us to keep bringing you more nights on the road. Story number 1. The mountain pass was marked on the atlas with one of those little dotted lines that always looked harmless in daylight. It had a soft, simple name on the sign, the kind people used in postcards, yet truckers called it the Notch. And those who'd been over it in winter didn't say much beyond that. Luis didn't mind mountain runs. He liked the way the world dropped away from the window, and the engine took on that deeper, purposeful hum. He was hauling dimensional lumber, heavy but honest, bound for a warehouse where night shift lights would blink him in and out like an aircraft approaching a quiet runway. It was a clear night when he approached the climb. Stars hung over the ridgeline like pinholes in velvet. The road widened and narrowed and widened again. The CB was mostly static. He kept it on anyway. Noise was better than the hush. On the shelf beside the seat, his coffee had gone lukewarm. He passed mile marker 103. He nodded at it the way drivers nod to familiar things, a small ritual against the size of the dark. "Keep your right foot light on the notch," a voice said over the CB. It was a man's voice, calm, not quite old, with a slow way of laying a sentence down like a strap across a load. Luis looked at the radio. The channel light was on. No one keyed up, just a low ribbon of static. He keyed anyway. "Copy that," he said, because it felt better than arguing with empty air. The grade began to assert itself. He dropped a gear and let the engine's growl slide down a step. Ahead, on a curve, he saw the bright rectangle of a reflective sign. Runaway ramp, 2 miles. He'd seen it on the map. There were 2 ramps, one on the upper grade, one halfway down the other side. In training, they taught you to keep count without thinking. He passed the sign, and the chartreuse paint flashed in his mirrors and was gone. A little fog lay in the notch like a pulled sheet. He'd expected that. The creek on the right always threw off a low mist. It was thin, almost delicate, swirling around the beams like something alive. He watched it coil and uncoil, and then he watched it stop, as if a wind he couldn't feel had suddenly died. "Runaway ramp 2 miles, the next sign said. He frowned. He had not driven 2 miles since the last one. He knew what 2 miles felt like at this speed. He'd gone a mile at most. He glanced at the odometer. 0.8. The road curved and the fog leaned, and the sign flashed by. He told himself there were 2 signs. People doubled them up. Maybe he'd missed an earlier one. The grade kept rising. The engine settled into that quiet strain that felt like a conversation with gravity. Mile marker 103 passed on his right again, bright and very neat, the paint on the numbers fresh. He looked at the clock. It was 12:13. He looked at the log tablet. It said the same. He didn't like that feeling, the one where a detail slips sideways without a sound. He tapped the steering wheel with 2 fingers, the tiny drumbeat that kept his thoughts from spreading too wide. He tuned the CB between channels until the static changed color and texture and meant something else entirely. Nothing. Just a soft hiss and the whisper of distant voices not meant for this road. He flicked to weather. "Patchy fog at higher elevations," the automated voice said. "Expect repeating conditions along the pass." It was the word repeating that caught him. He didn't remember the weather lady ever choosing that one. He passed a turnout with a view he'd seen in daylight, a soft valley, a ribbon of creek, a handful of roofs that collected morning sunlight in summer. Tonight the valley was a bowl of ink, and the roofs were imagined. He eased into the turnout for a minute and let the truck idle and listened to it shake the very air around him. He drank the last of the coffee. It was thin and bitter and somehow steadier than silence. He wrote the time in his log, not because he needed to, but because he wanted a mark in the book that said he had been exactly here. When he eased back on the road, he barely had time to settle before the sign came again. Runaway ramp 2 miles. He told himself the posts were closer here, that mountain engineers repeated themselves for good reason. He told himself that until the third time he passed mile marker 103. The CB clicked on its own. It didn't broadcast. It didn't beep. It just came alive in his ears like a person clearing their throat in a dark room. "Keep your right foot light," the calm voice said. "The notch doesn't like it when you lean into it." Luis didn't answer. He wasn't sure which part to talk to, and he didn't like the way words sat in his mouth at the moment. He drove. He set the cruise lower and kept his eyes for shadows. The fog wrapped and unwrapped around roadside pines. A light winked up on a slope where no house had a right to be. It blinked 3 times and stilled. He marked the next mile by counting breath. By 80, the marker should have appeared. It did. 103. It glowed on his right exactly where it had been before, with a scuff on the base and a small, crushed water bottle just beyond it. He remembered the bottle now. He remembered noting its specific brand and thinking, who buys the lemon kind? The same bottle, with the same tiny blue label caved in on one edge, lay there as if preserved. Luis slowed. The ramp sign appeared. He didn't want to see it again. He didn't want the world to hold still for him like a photograph he was trapped inside. He needed a change of frame. At the next turnout he did something he never did. He turned off the headlights. The world went soft and gray. The dash lights dimmed to a twilight of simple signals. Outside, the mountain revealed itself not by color but by outline. The fog lost its glow and became a dry river of shadow. He counted 5, and then he flipped the headlights back on. The fog gleamed. The ramp sign did not appear. On the CB, static curled like a sigh. That voice, not in front of him, not behind him, but somewhere near the center of the cab, like an old friend you forgot you trusted, came again. "That's better," it said. "You unset some of it. Keep right. Keep steady. Don't take the ramp. It doesn't take you where you think." Luis glanced at the ramps he had never seen. If the loop was real, if that's what it was, then the ramp had never arrived. It lived somewhere forward, a promise. He thought of the runaway ramps he'd used in training, the gravel grabbing the tires, the way the world slowed with a series of well-behaved tugs. This one, in the fog, in a loop, felt like a different sort of path. He passed an old billboard frame with no skin, just a black ladder against a blacker sky. He counted the crossbars and learned the shape with his eyes. He watched for it on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th repetition that he refused to grant the world. He didn't see it again. Instead, there was the way station. He wasn't expecting it yet. The building was a low, concrete block thing on a shelf to the right, with a small glass office that looked like a tiny aquarium full of light. The sign out front read open, then closed, then open, in a rhythm that wasn't possible with those old bulbs. Board inspectors did not amuse themselves flipping a switch like that in the dark. He rolled past slow enough to catch a reflection himself. His rig, the stripe of reflective tape, the silhouette of a man in the glass behind the desk, or maybe the memory of one. "Keep your right foot light," the radio breathed. "It's counting. It's upset." "What is?" he asked aloud without touching the mic. He felt ridiculous immediately. He didn't feel ridiculous enough to take it back. "The mountain," the voice said, lightly, like the answer should have been obvious all along. He passed mile marker 104. He laughed, not dramatically, not nervously, just a single breath of relief that someone had finally changed the numbers. He laughed again when, 2 minutes later, he passed it again. "Okay," he said, to the cab, to the night, to the little chorus of rattles in the upper hamper. He did something else he'd never done on that grade. He pulled the truck into the runaway ramp. The gravel embraced the tires with a series of dry crunches. The truck slowed. He brought it to a gentle stop in the middle of the ramp, half on habit, half because the incline was shallow. He was breathing hard, though he hadn't done anything strenuous at all. He kept one hand on the wheel. The CB went quiet in a very particular way, as if listening. He didn't get out. He told himself it was because he was professional that he didn't abandon a loaded truck on a grade, but that wasn't it. The air outside felt too composed, as if the world was holding itself very, very still. The slope of the ramp had no tracks on it at all. In the gravel, not a single cut, not a single mark, though this ramp had been here for years. He leaned forward. There, at the very top, something like a single long line, as if a wide tire had been dragged from above. A shape rolled down the ramp toward him. Not fast, not loud, not possible. He told himself it was a trick of the fog. The shape was a truck, boxy, older by its lines, the kind that made you think of postcards and cassette tapes. It rolled without engine, without a driver, without weight, and stopped 20 feet short of his bumper. He closed his eyes. He opened them. The ramp was empty. He left the ramp slowly, careful as if he might wake something. He checked his mirror and saw only his own trailer, an obedient rectangle in the dark. He put the truck back on the road. The mountain accepted him like someone who had gone out on the porch and come back in without making an announcement. Mile marker 105 came, plain and humdrum, and his hands loosened on the wheel involuntarily. It was a small, ordinary joy, and he held on to it like a warm cup in cold hands. He let the engine take the next grade down with a smooth, disciplined growl. The valley opened, not a bowl of ink now, but a landscape with edges. He passed the lower ramp without looking at it. He didn't want to know anything about the gravel at its crown. In the next town, the gas station was closed, but the soda machine still hummed. The way they sometimes do, hooked up to a circuit the lights forgot. He pulled in and stretched, and felt the night fold back a little. His tablet had a small red flag in the corner. He tapped it once, twice. The log showed he had passed mile 103 3 times in a row with identical timestamps. It was an error, the system said. He took a picture with his phone anyway, and put the phone back down like a weird seashell he didn't want in his pocket any longer than necessary. At the way station on the far side of the valley, a man in a neat shirt and a tie in a boring pattern asked him to pull around for a moment. He was polite, and his hair had been combed just before it had decided it would no longer be combed. "Can I ask you something?" the man said, in that tone officials use when they're about to say something not official at all. He turned the screen toward the window. The footage of the highway showed a truck like Luis's approach in the night. It rolled by. The timestamp clicked forward. The same truck rolled by again. The timestamp clicked forward. The same truck rolled by again. And for a moment, just long enough for a person to be sure before doubting, there was something small and silver under the bumper on the passenger side. Like a charm. Like a bell. "That's a glitch," the man said, as if he'd seen it too many times to call it anything else. "We'll reset it. Appreciate it," Luis said, and the man inclined his head once, like a person who didn't often meet agreement replayed back at him. He delivered the lumber. The warehouse lights were kind and tired. The forklift hummed. He napped in the cab, until dawn crept under the curtains, and made a line of pale on the floor that he could not ignore. He avoided the notch on the return trip and added an hour between himself and the mountain that sat there like a person waiting to be impressed. Weeks later, he heard a voice on the CB in a different state, on a night that rhymed with the one before, saying, light as if offering directions to a diner, "Keep your right foot easy in the notch." The driver it spoke to was a woman with a laugh in her voice that suggested she wasn't easily nudged. She said, "Copy," and told a story about how a deer had walked the center line a while, leading her down, ears up, tail flicking, not skittish at all. In diners at 4 a.m., where the coffee is stronger than the clock, and the eggs come with a grace that only exhausted people recognize, the pass is mentioned without details. It is not a monster story. It is not a boast. It is a reminder. The mountain counts. It learns drivers by the way they apply the brake, and by the rhythm of their turns. It can tell, the way a river can tell, whether you're listening or simply aiming. Sometimes, if you ask too many questions, the conversation thins out. The older drivers look out the window, even if there's only a brick wall 2 feet away. One of them, a man with hands like old leather and a voice like gravel warmed under sun, once said, not to anyone in particular, "When the sign repeats, you don't force your way out of it. You make a new path by being gentle where it expects you to be heavy." The next time Luis took a mountain pass, it was in daylight, and the world was a moving picture postcard. He said nothing to the road, and the road said nothing back, and he liked it that way. Yet sometimes, in a hotel room somewhere he couldn't name by the art on the wall, when the air conditioner hummed and the curtains breathed, he would hear the softest click of a CB being keyed, and a voice he did not know would say, "Very practical, utterly kind, keep your right foot light," and he would shift his foot under the sheet, and the motion would make a whisper that sounded almost like a reply. Story number 2. Mags took the load just before the last color left the sky. The cold storage warehouse exhaled a ribbon of fog when the dock plate lifted, and the workers signing her out wore a coat that looked too big, even for that refrigerated air. He was friendly in the automatic way of night shift people, a little soft around the edges, the same as the fluorescent lights over his head. "Set point's 34, he said, tapping the reefer's control panel with the back of a pen. "It's a good unit. Don't fight it. And it won't fight you." "Story of my life," Mags said, and the worker's smile twitched, the way humor lands late when a person's been awake too long. She did a walk-around while the paperwork printed. The trailer was clean, white as a tooth under the yard lights, reflective tape neat along the edges like a quiet halo. She checked the seals, the latch, the hinges. In the metal beside the control box, there was a shallow scratch, where someone had once etched a quick mark with a key or a nail, just a small crosshatch, a private tally. On the panel itself, the plastic lens had a hairline crack at the lower right, and the status light beneath it glowed a steady, agreeable green. Mags climbed into the cab and eased out of the yard. The highway accepted her with that gentle, elastic feeling of a long stretch willing to be used. In the mirrors, the trailer rode steady, the way good loads do, like a calm person in a crowd. Out beyond the city, the land flattened and spread. Wind turbines blinked their red lights in a measured beat along the horizon, synchronized like a distant, enormous heart. The radio was low. She wasn't in the mood for chatter. She preferred the simple company of the engine and the occasional line of a song she half remembered. Out here, a person could think without thinking too hard. She passed a sign announcing, "Crosswind Bridge 52 miles," and another that said, "Expect gusts." The evening had started easy, a tame breeze combing the fields, but she knew how quickly tread marks could scribble on that bridge if the air decided to have its say. She made a note to herself. Steady hands, exact speed, nothing abrupt. The reefer hummed to itself as faithfully as a metronome. Every so often, the unit's little screen pinged, and the numbers rolled. 34 farads. 34 farads. 34.1 farads. It was a reassuring thing, that tiny agreement between a machine and a promise on a bill of lading. She had hauled uglier cargo dry loads with shifting pallets that knocked like impatient knuckles, or awkward machinery that vibrated at odd harmonics, making the whole rig feel haunted by a dentist's drill. Produce was different. People fed it, and it fed people. And the responsibility felt somewhere close to useful. Half an hour into the run, as the last seam of orange left the west and the road turned a deeper shade of ordinary, the reefer display flickered. It wasn't a dramatic thing. The segments that usually made numbers blinked, and for a breath, formed letters. Slow. She frowned at that. The little screen went right back to 34 farads, as if embarrassed to have been caught doing anything else. Loose segment, she said to herself. The way you say something aloud to put it in a box where you can see it. She eased off the throttle a fraction anyway. Old habits. 5 seconds later, a deer stepped out of the ditch like it had changed its mind about the route to the creek, and started across the lane with all the certainty of a person who had never met a truck. She had time. Slowing had given her that. She let the deer finish its errand and slip into the grass on the median. The reefer hummed. She watched its reflection in the passenger side mirror, a little square of steady glow among all that mute night. A few miles later, the unit pinged again. The numbers rolled, then the segment snapped for an instant. Left. Then back to 34 farads. 30 paces beyond a slight bend, a ladder lay in the right lane, the aluminum shining like a fish in the headlights. She signaled, glided into the passing lane, glided back when her instincts stopped bristling. "All right," she said. "You and me are either friends tonight or I need a mechanic faster than most interstates can conjure one." The road ran west where it could and north where it had to, cutting through gentle hills that kept trying to be something else. She passed an old diner with a neon bird on its sign that had lost 2 feathers to electrical boredom. The lot was empty except for a pickup pointed at the far fence, a ghostly shape under an unlit canopy. She thought of coffee, and then thought of the bridge, and kept going. The breeze leaned harder. Grass laid itself down and lifted again. The radio offered a forecast recorded hours ago, and not yet wrong. Gusty after midnight. Hold on to your hats. Mags sipped water and kept the wheel easy. She liked wind, not quarreling with it, exactly. But listening to the way a rig told you where it was, how much of itself it was willing to give the lane. The reefer chimed and said doer for one blink. Then 34 farads. That's not funny, she said. She checked the trailer icon on the dash, which didn't have a door sensor on a unit this old. She checked the mirror for an obvious sign, the bright twist of a seal flailing in breezy impatience. The seal lay perfectly still against the latch, as obedient as a button. She took the next rest area. It wasn't much, 2 vending machines, a low building with a tiled bathroom that maintained a kind of institutional cleanliness, a couple of picnic tables that believed in sunny afternoons. The sodium lamps hummed in that ancient, papery tone they adopt around midnight. One other truck sat nose in on the far end, lights off, curtains drawn. There was a sedan with its hazards on at the car side, blinking like a heartbeat a little too quick. Mags walked the trailer with her flashlight, seal intact, hinges solid, door tight. The cold bristled against her palm when she laid it on the metal, and the air coming out around the gasket did not smell like anything but clean. Inside, palletized greens and boxes of berries, all the good stuff of somebody's morning. She resisted the urge to peer through the little edge around the door. Night had made a house outside, no reason to make another one behind. On the way back to the cab, she saw movement in the corner of her eye. She turned and found only the vending machines, one with a dead row of numbers, one with an image of a sandwich that promised more than it could deliver. The sedan's hazard lights ticked along. She caught a glimpse of someone inside, a hunched shape bathed in red. They didn't wave. They didn't ask for help. The rest area seemed to be holding its breath like a swimmer under a dock. In the cab, the reefer's status light had gone from green to a soft, insistent pulse. The display read go for a single syllable before settling back into numerals. Okay, she said, buckling in. Fine by me. Back on the interstate, the night opened. Semi by semi, mile by mile, the company changed and then thinned. Another sign for the bridge came and went. The wind tested the corners of the trailer and then tried again, the way a polite person stands up to leave and sits back down for one last thought. In her mirrors, the lights of other rigs shone like little towns that refused to stay put. She had half an ear on a station out of a town she wouldn't see until morning. The host's voice was low, nearly a whisper, telling the kind of stories that belong to local airwaves, the pet parade next Saturday, the history of a library's mural. If the road was the sea, those small human details were buoys. She liked knowing someone, somewhere, was talking about a raffle in a church basement at the same time her trailer crossed a county line in the dark. The reefer beeping wound up again, 3 quick notes, and the display ticked down, 33.9, 33.8, 33.6. It shouldn't, not on its own, not on a consistent load. She adjusted the set point, made sure 34 held, and watched it respect the order like a good student. 30 seconds later, it slipped to 33.7. Don't do that, she said, not scolding, more like the tone you use when someone's about to drop a plate while insisting they aren't. She checked the fuel level for the unit. Full. Voltage to the controller, steady. The air around her felt fine. No frost on the front of the box, no visible trouble. Only those little numbers getting ideas. She took the exit for a big truck stop that sat like a spaceship off the highway, its canopy a bright, hovering thing above a dozen wide islands. The mechanic on overnights there was a patient man with a baseball cap that had once been blue and a coffee that had been black longer than it had been warm. Temperature drift on a unit like that, he said. Could be the sensor. Could be the controller. Could be the units just reminding you it's alive. Watch the light. Green is green. Useful, thanks, she said, because sometimes the answer was not a fix, just a companionable nod from someone else awake. When she stepped back into the night, the reefer flashed stay and returned to digits. The wind stamped around the aluminum skin of the trailer like a restless foot. She thought about grabbing a bunk. She thought about the bridge. She chose the road. The miles fell away in patient increments. Somewhere around the county line with the name she liked for no good reason, the reefer went to wait and pulsed its status light as if it were a heartbeat not her own. The sign for Crosswind Bridge next right rose out of the dark, like something chiseled there by older hands. She coasted into the turnout before the span. and watched the sky give away its stars to a lower ceiling of cloud. Above the tarmac, the wind played its instrument. You could hear the resonance of the girders when it wanted you to. Trucks ahead eased onto the bridge and grew smaller with a dancer's caution. She could go. She could keep her pace, keep her nerve, do the work. Instead, she listened to the nervous bit of plastic on the nose of her trailer tell her a word again. Wait. She waited. The gust came without sound, a freight of air bigger than the river it crossed, and dragged itself along the railings with a force that moved light. A box truck halfway between the pylons shuddered and corrected and found center again. But not before the right side tires rode a pale, startled line of rubber on the lane. A moment later, the wind sagged down, as if embarrassed by its own outburst. The signs along the shoulders blinked from caution to open in a few clicks. On the far end, the box truck put on its hazards and took the first exit to go breathe somewhere smaller. The reefer's lights steadied into green. She guided the rig onto the bridge. The river was a black ribbon underneath, the kind that keeps secrets in ordinary language and trusts you to translate. The girders thunked in their little iron moans as she passed, and the tires made harmonies against the seams. Halfway across, her own reflection in the window looked like someone else for a second different angle, different thoughts, and then just her again. The rest of the night was made of simpler things. A man in a pickup passed too close, a little impatient and a lot distracted. A tumbleweed rolled across the shoulder like it had places to be. The smell of distant rain wandered in and out of the cab with the vent. The reefer, perhaps satisfied with its new role as passenger and guide, settled into virtuous, boring math. When the horizon lightened, it did so from a place far off to her right, and in that slow brightening the shapes of things declared themselves farmhouses built from square logic, silos like polite giants, a line of trees that had agreed years ago to stand there together. The distribution center hove into view as a low, sprawling block of possibility, its dock lights blinking, its yardmen wearing orange vests, as if the sun needed help being noticed. She backed the trailer into door 17, with only the usual negotiation between pride and physics. The dock plate met the trailer with a thud that had seen the world. The reefer purred like a cat pretending it had nothing to say. In the receiving office, a woman in a green hoodie initialed her paperwork and pushed a stamp at the right place without looking. "You're early," she said, in a tone that was almost praise. "You've got Hank's old unit on there. Do the numbers treat you okay?" Mags blinked. The name sat curiously on top of the morning, like a paperweight waiting for a paper it always belonged to. "Hank?" she said. The woman nodded at the yard. "We scrounged that unit after the storm last winter. Our old one went sentimental on us, wouldn't hold a set point for anything. This one came over from a company that lost, well." She flicked her hand in a gesture that meant there'd been a bad night on a bad bridge, and left it at that. Good unit anyway, reliable. Sometimes a little talkative on the display if you believe the guys who bring in the lettuce at 3 a.m. Mags signed where the sticker told her to sign. "Talkative," she repeated, as if trying on a coat. Out at the dock, the forklift beeped a polite warning and slipped pallets away into the morning. Mags walked the nose of the trailer. The control panel looked as bland and practical as ever. In the right light, the hairline crack made a small river. Up close, below the lens, someone had scratched a tiny shape that looked like the start of a letter H. It wasn't deliberate enough to be graffiti. It was more like the mark you make absent-mindedly with a key while waiting for the coffee machine to acknowledge you. She touched it with her glove. The status light glowed steady. The display read 34 farads and then done, then back to numbers as if embarrassed again. "Thank you," she said softly. A silly thing, to an inanimate thing. But the kind of silly that makes sense when the night and a job solve themselves together. The light did not change. Then again, a reflection from the forklift strobe crossed it and made it seem to blink, once, as if to humor her. In the cab, she wrote her notes. Neat as a person leaves a campground they like. Dispatch pinged to ask if the bridge had given her any trouble. "Clear," she typed, and caught herself adding, "waited for a gust," then deleting it, then adding it again. She didn't need to explain the reefer. She didn't need to explain anything. She only wanted the sentence to remember the pause. On her way out, she stopped by the yard office to borrow a marker and wrote on a strip of tape she kept for fixing rattles and fussy map edges. She stuck the tape on the inside of her cab door, where only she would see. It said, "Liston." On the way back past the trailer rows, she looked at the line of white boxes, each with its own quiet song, each one a refrigerator among many, all of them ordinary. A breeze lifted a corner of a wrapper and set it down without making a scene. She felt that old highway sleepiness trying to take the keys from her hands and tuck her into a bunk that smelled like laundry soap and dust. She obliged. She eased into a spot along the fence, pulled the curtain, and lay there, not thinking, until the line between road and rest softened. When she woke, the sun was up and the world had decided to be made of normal things again. She stretched, checked her mail, and stepped down to do one more walk around out of habit. The reefer on the now empty trailer clicked quietly as it cooled its own thoughts. She wouldn't swear to it later, wouldn't have bet on it. But for a second as she passed, she saw the display shape the word, "safe." Then it turned off as if finally allowed to sleep. She stood there with her glove on the cool panel and realized how some nights, even the machines meant to keep lettuce crisp and berries bright, seemed to want to steer you clear of something with no name. It wasn't the sort of thing you brought up over hash browns with people who have to believe in bolts and torque and the patience of routine. It was the sort of thing you kept between you and the long road, a private grammar made of beeps and wind, and a choice to wait on a shoulder while the river remembered itself. By the time she fueled up and pointed the tractor toward her next pickup, the wind had calmed. The turbines on the ridge blinked in easy chorus. She merged into traffic, and the highway rolled out like a low song. Somewhere behind her, a worker slid a new pallet into a cold bay and wiped their hands on the front of a heavy coat. Somewhere ahead, another driver adjusted their mirror and wondered if the night would ask anything of them besides patience. The reefer on her last load sat at a dock door, quiet. If it had words left, they were for the next person or for the morning air itself. Mags rubbed at the sleep in her eyes, took a breath like a promise, and went looking for another set of miles. Story number 3. Jonah loaded the spools as evening worked the color out of the yard. The cable was glossy and dark, wrapped in miles of promise around wooden drums as tall as his shoulder. He liked flatbeds for that no guessing, no doors between him and what he was hauling. Just straps, checks, and the quiet pride of lines drawn tight. Each ratchet strap sang a short, clean note when he leaned on it with the bar. Somewhere inside the spools, tension hummed like a held breath. Dispatch had given him a route that stitched 2 states together along an old toll road, the kind that had seen seasons come and go enough times to learn to keep its history to itself. It was under construction in sections. Signs on the main line flashed, "Night work ahead, USE, CB, CH, 13. Follow pilot car." The boards blinked their amber arrows in a patient, mechanical wink that made the darkness look attentive. He rolled steady toward the ramp for the toll road. The sky was a deep, almost blue-gray, with one last plane sliding under a bank of clouds like a silver fish. The air smelled faintly of creosote and cut grass, and something else he couldn't name, a clean scent that sometimes rises from brand-new asphalt. They had closed the entry with cones and drums, orange shapes that had their own quiet gravity in the high beams. An arrow board pointed into a narrow lane, where the shoulder had become a corridor. A flagger stood with a paddle at the hip, slow on one side, stop on the other, and a vest that glowed like the inside of a pumpkin. She didn't lift the paddle for him. She only tipped her chin toward the sign. Tune CB to 13. He clicked the knob and let the familiar hiss resolve into a smaller sound, like a radio station 2 towns away. A clear voice reached him, level and unhurried. "Convoy 2, line up at the gate. Keep 2 markers between trucks. We'll go light on light. If you can't see my light, tell me." 3 rigs idled ahead in the lane. A lowboy carrying a tracked loader. A van trailer with a faded mural of a fruit on the side. A tanker with a blue stripe and an overpolite logo. Jonah eased in behind them. On the right, the empty toll booths stood like little glass aquariums with the lights off. Hand-lettered signs had been taped to the windows. "Cash only. When staffed, be nice." The last bit made him smile despite himself. A compact car nosed out from the staging area, amber light bar ticking, "Follow me" in black letters on a magnetic sign. It was neat, clean, nondescript, the sort of car that looked right in a state garage. It made a slow arc and settled at the head of their line. "Convoy 2, you're with me. the voice said. Blue tanker, you're third. Flatbed with the dark spools, you're fourth. 2 markers between, please. We'll take the eastbound inner and run it quiet. Jonah glanced at the dash. The cigar lighter splitter flickered, as it always did when the CB met a certain frequency. He checked his mirrors. 2 reflective lane markers sat between him and the tanker's rear axle, catching his lights like tiny stars. He exhaled and let the rig lean into the low-grade hum of a slow roll. They slipped past the flagged gate and into a world that had been emptied by cones. The pilot car's amber bar cut a little path through the dark. The voice on the radio narrated not like a tour guide, but like a friend counting steps under their breath where the stairs turn uneven. We're going to climb 100 feet through the cut, pavement polished. Keep your right tires out of the groove where the old lane ended. Lights look good on all of you. Thank you. The cut had been blasted decades ago, 2 walls of layered rock rising like a book open to the middle. Rain had painted it darker wherever it found a ledge. Little ferns had decided to live there, brave and domestically green. The night made all that geology into silhouettes and suggestions. The drums and cones wore reflective collars like necklaces. It was, for a few moments, a quiet parade. Why 13? The tanker said, easy drawl. The kind that made ordinary curiosity sound like a song. Work channel, the voice said. Keeps the chatter off 19. Eyes up, we've got a depressed joint ahead. Slow your steer wheels so I can keep you off the edge. Loader, you're tall. Mind the arm. Jonah eased over the seam and felt the low jostle of a concrete panel too tired to lie perfectly with its neighbor. The spools gave a soft ring through the straps, a sound so faint it might have been memory. He tightened his grip and then released it, settling into that long-awake mode where your hands think before you do. Up on a little rise, an overhead sign flashed, Roadwork 2 miles. The font looked older than the signs he'd grown used to, a different thickness, a different spacing, and for no good reason it made him feel like he'd stepped into a photograph that had been waiting on a diner wall too long. The marshlands began after the rise. The road flattened and straightened on a causeway that lifted the TX above water and reeds, and the suggestion of a river braided through both. Fog lay low out there, kept honest by the wind. The pilot car turned its light down to a steady, soft pulse. On the radio, the voice said, "This part makes people chatter. Keep the 2 markers. Keep it ghost. Quiet." He wanted to ask what ghost quiet meant, but he did not, because sometimes a phrase doesn't want the lid picked up. He listened to his tires as if to a room where someone was asleep. The world narrowed to the beam and the rhythmic flash of the pilot car, and for a while, he forgot there was anything else. Halfway across the causeway, the fog lifted into wisps like small banners, and the light there took on a strange quality cool, as if the night had freshened itself. In that light, they passed a section where barrels had been placed closer still to a Jersey barrier, so chipped it looked pale. "Center up," the voice said quietly. "Loader, pause. Tanker, breathe. Flatbed, keep the spool quiet. There's a crosswind." As if it had been waiting to be acknowledged, the wind pressed a long palm against the trailer's side, and then withdrew. Jonah's straps trembled the tiniest amount and were still. He glanced down and, just for a second, saw the reflection of words moving across the glass of his Speedo. "Below me." Though the pilot car was half a curve ahead now, its light turned sideways by distance. He blinked, and the glass showed only the numbers he expected. They took a loop around a closed exit with a ramp that went nowhere for the moment, and came back onto the main line. On the shoulder stood a lone arrow board flashing a left lane closure, for a lane that no longer existed, not here. The board's black face swallowed light like a sky. "Ignore that one," the voice said. "He's a leftover. We've got one more pinch. We'll hold and let a crane finish what it's thinking." They slowed to a stop over a long seam. The loader's stacks ticked like a metronome. The tanker's engine changed its note and settled. Jonah opened his window and heard the marsh talking to itself in little clicks. Far off, a crane moved with improbable patience, as if it had traded mass for courtesy. A signalman stood under it with a glow wand, the wand drawing calm circles in the air. "Please and thank you," the circles said without saying it. "Where's the pilot anyway?" "I've got the light, but I don't see your bumper," the lowboy asked. Not rude, just the curiosity that grows in pauses. 10 truck. Lengths ahead, the voice said. "At the joint, watching you in the mirror." Flatbed, your rear strap on the driver's side has a tail. Tuck it under the run when we pause again, or it'll sing when we hit the steel grates. Jonah craned the mirror and saw it just an inch of loose fabric where he'd swear he'd tidied everything. He'd been proud of that clean line. He imagined the strap humming at speed on grates and said, "Copy, thank you." His hand went to the glove, lay on the passenger seat on reflex, empty air where a fix would go. They crawled again. At the joint, the crane took a step the way cranes do, lifting one leg to move another world forward. Something metal tapped the deck. A coin dropped and reconsidered. "Stop," the voice said, even before the sound had really become a sound. They stopped. A nut rolled into the lane ahead exactly where the tanker's steer tires would have been if they'd coasted without thinking. A man in a vest hustled out, picked it up, held it in both hands like a bird. He lifted his face toward them, a little smile almost visible at that distance, and walked back to the dark, like a parent backing out of a room where someone is finally asleep. They eased on. The pilot car's light reappeared, more a relationship to the fog than a beacon. Jonah relaxed in increments. He hadn't known he'd tensed. The radio stayed quiet for a while, filled only with the soft, practical noise of rigs being good at the thing they were for. Somewhere past a double crossover into contraflow, where the westbound had become both ways, the fruit van driver spoke in a voice that sounded like late-night AM radio. "Lady, you got a name? You're the best traffic cone I ever followed." There was a beat. Then the voice said, almost amused, "No need for names. We'll all be at mile 12 soon. There's a service plaza. Fuel, showers, coffee that is better than it remembers being. Check your straps there, flatbed. And you're welcome. Mile 12, copy," Jonah said, though a small, strange thing pinched inside him. He had not given his position in the line. The words, "flatbed with the spools," had been true, and they had also known more than he had said. The roadway grew less complicated. Signs returned to their usual rhythms. The cones thinned until they were no longer a crowd but a few spaced-out guests waiting for their ride. The pilot car's light dimmed, and then was simply another color at the edge of everything. "Convoy 2, clear to mile 12. I'll pick up 3 on the other side of the plaza," the voice said. "Keep 2 markers between, and let the night be what it is." The toll plaza rose ahead, long and low, its booths dark. Once, a million headlights had reflected in that glass. Tonight, light just passed by. A single sign overlane read "Easy Pass Only" in a font that had outlived its designer. Jonah felt a twinge of habit, as if he ought to find cash, find a person, say hello. The pilot car rolled under the canopy, and oddly did not cast a reflection on the windows. That detail stuck to him like a burr, even as he convinced himself he had just been looking a fraction of a second late. They took the slip to the plaza. The place lay bright against the dark, a little island of white-tinted safety. He eased into a space along the far fence, where he could see his whole trailer in the mirrors. The other trucks took islands near the diesel pumps. The loader idled, a low, loyal sound. He stepped down and walked his straps with his gloves on. Sure enough, the tail near the rear driver had teased itself proud. He tucked it under and smoothed the run, letting the strap settle with a small sigh. He rounded the spools one more time, checking edge protectors, smiling inwardly at the way the cable seemed to sleep on its wooden drums. Inside, the air was too cold, the way those places always are, and smelled faintly of coffee, showers, and the cinnamon roll someone had microwaved too far. An attendant behind the counter had a crossword and a pen that clicked. Jonah bought water and a coffee that pleased him by trying, and asked, conversational, "You running pilot cars tonight?" The attendant looked up. She had that shift worker's knowledge in her eyes, the kind that could produce a broom, a key, or a story on request. "No escorts at night," she said. "We've got day crews when they're moving big steel. Nights are open except for the lane closures." "Why?" "Just followed one," he said, with a little shrug that turned it into small talk. "CB13, good driver. Kept us all lined up and out of trouble." The attendant's mouth did a thoughtful thing. "You're on 13? She said, as if making sure she had the number right. Sign said to be. "We used to run 13, she said, back when the old toll plazas still had people in them at this hour. There was a flagger, kept that channel clean, kept the night calm. Elena. She was Good at it. People still talk about her, but they don't run escorts at night. Not since... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Her pen clicked once, twice, as if to underline an unspoken line. Jonah nodded. The coffee was hot in a way that felt like a handshake. Somebody was out there, he said, gentle. Whoever it was, they made the night feel less empty. On the wall near the door, among the lost and found notices and the ad for a local band that had probably already played and gone home, a small laminated square caught his eye. It was a photograph of a woman in a high-vis vest and a hard hat, smiling as if someone she loved had just walked into the frame. Elena Park, 1979, 2012, said the caption. Slow down for those who guide you. Beneath it, someone had taped a strip that read, Channel 13. Keep it kind. He stood there a second longer than he meant to, feeling something settle in his chest, like a coin you save instead of spend. On the way out, he passed a bulletin board where drivers had pinned notes. Thanks for the lift after the flood. Great pie. Watch the wind on the causeway. A faded CB call sign with a little heart drawn next to it made him smile because it seemed like a joke without a punchline, and he had always liked those. Back at the rig, the sky had changed one shade while he wasn't looking. The others had already gone, lights returning to the highway like fireflies deciding to be stars. He sat in the cab a moment, listening. The CB hummed the low, happy static of a machine not being asked too much. He clicked the mic. Appreciate the escort, he said, not expecting an answer and not deciding exactly who he meant to hear him. You kept the spool quiet. The radio breathed. The night outside did that thing that makes the edges of the world clear for a second. Then a voice came back, as level and unhurried as before. 2 markers, flatbed. You're clear to 21. After that, you're on your own with the morning. Keep it kind. He smiled despite himself. Copy, he said. And the word felt like putting something back where it belongs. He rolled the rig onto the ramp and found the main line simply there, as if it had never been complicated. The pilot car was nowhere to be seen now. The toll plaza looked like a building in a picture that moment before or after something important, preserved regardless. The old sign fonts gave way to the new. The fog on the marsh took a breath he could not hear. As the miles unfolded, the hum in the spools changed in tiny ways. Only someone sitting above them would have noticed. It stabilized into a steady, contented line, the kind a string makes when tuned and left alone. Out beyond the reach of his lights, the cranes rested. The drums blinked patiently. The cones did their good work by simply existing. Somewhere along the way, the wind slid its palm along the side of the trailer and then went off to talk to the trees. By dawn, Jonah had put the construction behind him and traded it for the ordinary dramas of the morning 4 ways at the bottom of an exit, a school bus that knew its route like a song, a man walking his dog along a fence. He pulled into a lay-by and checked the straps one more time, out of habit, and for the quiet pleasure of finding everything exactly as it should be. The tail he'd tucked stayed tucked, as if pleased to have been seen. On certain nights thereafter, when the world had that feeling like a theater after the audience goes home, he kept 13 open for a while. Sometimes the channel was only the old static. Sometimes another driver told a joke flat enough to be a blessing. And sometimes, in work zones the maps didn't plan for, a woman's voice would come through as if she had leaned over a counter to speak into a hard-won calm. 2 markers, eyes up, keep it kind. He would listen and do exactly as he was told. Story number 4. Dana took the westbound after midnight, the kind of hour that makes the interstate feel private. Her trailer held giant rolls of paper, strapped neatly and nestled like sleeping giants inside the box. Heavy, honest weight. The sky was the kind of black that swallows landmarks and gives you only the lines you need. Lane markers, reflectors, the occasional star hanging stubbornly over a field. The radio murmured with easy chatter far apart. Her pre-pass transponder sat on the windshield, a little square of common sense that had saved her more than a few slow rolls across scales. It gave a single green blink at a pass station, a polite little nod, and she drove on into the thinner hours where towns switch off most of their lights and houses become ideas more than places. A sign rose out of the dark, Way Station 7 miles. The arrow beneath it glowed with that public, work certainty, as if the sign and the station were old friends who never forgot each other's birthdays. She checked her weight and her head legal on every axle, paperwork tidy, nothing to worry about. The transponder would likely chirp green. She took a sip of coffee and let the engine settle into a comfortable hum. At 6 miles, the transponder woke with a tone she knew. Single chirp, green dot. Bypass, in a tiny font that made an odd kind of sense. Then, 3 seconds later, the device gave another sound, a softer tone, like a sound you hear through a wall, and the little screen changed. Stop ahead. She frowned. She tapped it lightly, like someone nudging a sleepy pet. Green again, then the words returned. Stop ahead. The device had never done that. These things weren't chatty. They had a vocabulary of 3 ideas and the personality of a thermostat. She clicked the mic and asked the air, not expecting much. Any of you getting weird transponder messages for the westbound scale? A voice came back from somewhere behind her, cheerful in that bleary way. Green light for me. Sail on. Another voice. Close lights usually on at night. They don't staff it past 10. The next overhead sign contradicted both. We station open, it said, with an arrow sweeping down in a confident curve. The little building to the right, still a mile off, stood lit like a miniature airport terminal, canopy lamps painting neat circles on the pavement. The open sign glowed that particular green that always looked colder than it should. Dana drifted to the right lane and took her foot out of it a little. She'd learned long ago that sometimes information disagrees with itself, just to see if you're paying attention. The transponder blinked green a 3rd time. No tone. A quiet, I changed my mind. She laughed once, softly. All right. Have it your way. She followed the white lines across the gore point and into the way station's long approach. The place felt different. From the road quieter, not because of sound, but because of intention, as if the angles of the buildings, the placement of the cones, the very attitude of the canopy, had decided to lower their voices around her. Trucks idled up ahead in a simple queue, maybe 6 of them, their exhausts writing faint gray cursive in the air. Across the top of the first lane, a red LED panel read Lane 1. Slow. The arrow beneath it ticked left, then right, then steadied left again. Her transponder chimed one more time and displayed Lane 2. The rightmost lane lay empty, its scale plates a dull graphite under the lights. The sign above that lane came to life, as if embarrassed to have been late. Lane 2 open. Slow. She took it, cautious. Tires whispering over the grooved concrete, paper rolls riding like obedient moons. On the glass of the scalehouse office, reflections of her own headlights met in little stars. The office itself looked empty. A corkboard hung with notices. Hours. A clean printout of holiday schedule. A small flyer with a faded ribbon on it, edges curled. No silhouette moved behind the counter. No coffee steam. No board inspector with a pen tapping a form. Only a desk lamp, on but turned away, throwing a pale wedge of light on a stack of papers. The lane sign flicked. Stop. She eased to a halt and watched the numbers on the little roadside display roll up past sensible weights. She didn't really need to see them. She knew her numbers by feel and habit, but the ritual pleased her. Steer, drive, trailer, gross. The display paused a heartbeat too long on gross and then scrolled to a word she didn't expect. Hold. She let the brake hold the weight and thought about calling it in on the intercom. There wasn't one she could see. No speaker grill crackled. The CB was quiet right then, between jokes and requests for location checks. The sign above the lane repeated itself, as if for punctuation. Hold. 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 Okay, she said to the wheel. The old building beside the lane made a small sound like a fan searching for a speed it had used to have. Out beyond the canopy, the highway rolled on, trucks slipping by with an easy whoosh, their drivers probably enjoying the feeling of being waved past a thing that had made other drivers stop. Minute 2 turned into minute 5. The transponder, docile thing that it was, displayed nothing but a blank green eye. Her coffee had cooled into something honest but not kind. She considered easing forward, just to see if the sign would change its mind. Before she could test the theory, the LED board at the edge of the highway flashed a new message. Right lane closed ahead. Then, merge left. Then, stay left. The ramp from the scale house fed directly back into that right lane. The first hint of why came not as a sound, but as a change in brightness. Blue-white strobes law enforcement, sharp as winter opened like flowers a mile ahead. They grew larger quickly, scattering a shimmer on guardrails and reflective paint. A trooper pulled to the gore point between highway and station, nose to the triangle of grass, and set flares in a measured line that hissed like polite snakes. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He faced the highway and raised one hand with 2 fingers extended, in a signal that wasn't for her, and yet felt like it was. Her mirror filled with the faint red of flares bouncing off her white trailer. Somewhere out there, a truck had taken an angle it hadn't meant to take. No sirens, no drama. Just that certain hush that comes over a scene where everyone has decided to be careful. The lane sign in front of Dana softened from hold to wait. The difference between the words wasn't much, and somehow meant everything. Wait, like a hand on your shoulder that knows the shape of your patience. She unclenched something she hadn't meant to tighten and let herself simply sit. The trooper lifted a flare and walked a slow S across the merge. He stood still until the next truck ahead had glided past the hazard, and then waved it left with that authority born of reflective gear and long practice. After what felt like 6 minutes, and was probably 3, he looked toward the scale house, toward her, and tipped his head in a gesture so contained it might have been nothing. The sign over her lane changed. Proceed. Slow. She rolled forward. At the lip where the way station's ramp joined the interstate, a second little sign sat on a pole nearly lost to the architecture of the place. It was one of those amber dot matrix panels that usually read, "Thank you, drive safely." Tonight, it said, with odd intimacy, "Safe now." Dana blinked and didn't smile until she had merged and matched the slow stream's pace. In the mirror, the tiny building and its neat canopy receded, the green open sign glowing on, though it likely hadn't had anyone to attend it. She slid past the trooper at the next mile, giving the traditional gentle tap of the hazards in thanks. He didn't acknowledge it. He didn't need to. He was busy drawing invisible lines the road would remember later. The CB filled with a kind of collective exhale. "Anybody else catch a weird detour at the scale?" a voice asked. A second voice said they'd blown by with a green, only to be waved left by the trooper amid a confusion of cones that had not existed 5 minutes before. Someone made a joke about the ghosts of waymasters past keeping late hours. Dana kept her mic off. She didn't know what to say that wouldn't make the moment smaller. The next town's name came up on a square green sign that had probably seen more sun than it let on. A gas station glowed modestly at the edge of the exit ramp. She took it, feeling the kind of tired that comes not from hours but from thinking in too many directions. She idled under the canopy, filled her tanks, and followed the small lane around back where truckers tucked in for coffee and a brief walk to remind legs what they were for. Inside the store, the coffee smelled more hopeful than excellent, which at that hour was about right. A clerk with a knit cap pulled low and a badge that said Ryan slid a paper cup her way and asked if she wanted a receipt. The television over the lottery display tried to sell windshield wipers to people who already had some. "Scales open tonight?" Dana asked, because sometimes the smallest question is the polite way into the larger one. Ryan blew on their tea and shrugged in a way that meant they knew things and would share a few. "Sign says open when it wants. Timing switch went weird after a storm last year. Nights it's lit up like a stadium and nobody home. Other nights it's dark as a barn and a guy is in there doing crosswords. Depends who drew the short straw." "Did you get pulled?" "Kind of," Dana said, and chose her words like stepping stones. "It told me to hold, and then to wait, and then to go. Felt intentional." Ryan's eyebrows did a small climb. "Scale telling you to wait saved my uncle a bumper last fall," they said, tapping the counter with a rhythm that seemed to belong to the story. "He runs cattle, went to reset a strap, and the little board at the end of the ramp flashed wait. He laughed because, you know, those boards say thank you, and that's about it. But he stood there anyway. 2 minutes later, a bale came loose off a hay rig right where he would have merged, flew off and landed in pieces like confetti with a bad attitude. He says the sign looked brighter for a second, like it was pleased with itself. Maybe the DOT got sentimental and put an AI in the box, Dana said, joking to move the air around them. Ryan smiled. If they did, it likes the polite words. Back in the cab, Dana reached up and touched the transponder with a fingertip, the way a person taps a picture frame to straighten it. "Green dot, quiet. The highway received her again. On a long, flat run that smoothed her thoughts, she clicked on the weather band. It talked about high winds on an east-west corridor. She wouldn't see until dawn. She let it murmur on, the robotic cadence somehow comforting. Her mirrors held the road's long, red pinpricks behind. Out ahead, the world kept offering itself 1/4 mile at a time. Near dawn, she turned into a rest area where the trees were planted in polite rows and the sidewalks curved like notes on paper. A small bulletin board near the bathrooms held the usual notices: no parking on grass, pet area rules, plus a sheet in plastic that caught her pause. It had a black ribbon printed at the top. In memory of Inspector L. Garner, it read, "Thank you for years of night duty. Drive safe. We'll meet you down the road." Beside the name was a photo. A man with a weathered face and clear eyes under the brim of a hat, mid-laugh at something just out of frame. The caption below said, "He kept the night kind." Dana stood there longer than a person needs to read 10 words. The trees kept their early morning whisper. A magpie hopped along the curb with the look of someone inspecting a property they might buy. When she rolled out again, the pre-pass chirped its clean, useful little tone for the next scale bypass, no nonsense. She thought of the way the word wait had looked in pixels, each dot a tiny yes. She thought of the trooper's flare and the steady line of light it drew in the dark. She thought of the coffee on the counter and the clerk's uncle and hay unraveling like a bad idea saved at the last moment by a pause. Later that week, on a different route, she swapped stories with a driver in a diner where the eggs came with their own sunshine, and the waitress refilled coffee until you remembered your name. The driver had a way of talking slow that made each word settle into place like equipment in a well-organized trailer. "Ever get the scale telling you to hang a minute?" he asked. Dana nodded. "Good," he said. "Means you got one of the kind ones." "You say that like there are others," she said, smiling. He smiled back. "There are stations that push. There are stations that just measure. And there are stations that look up from their numbers and notice you." She did not ask how he knew. Some things traveled along the highways like rumors that took on just enough shape to be useful and not enough to be bragged about. She found she preferred them that way. On a clear afternoon months later, the route carried her past the same little scale house. Sun poured over it like a reason not to remember the dark. The open sign was off. The canopy lights looked ordinary. The corkboard in the window had a new paper pinned to it. Hours. Nights left blank. The tiny dot matrix sign at the exit was still. As she glided past on the main line, doing the speed of somebody with no need to hurry, the transponder blinked awake for a heartbeat and showed a single word she would have sworn was not part of its vocabulary. "Easy," she laughed, alone in the cab with the kind of laugh that isn't loud but lasts a while. Up ahead, the day stretched itself across the road. An uncomplicated success. Somewhere behind her, flares were swept up and thrown away. Troopers went back to their cars, coffee cooled in forgotten cups, and a little building with a green sign faced another night with the kind of patience places sometimes learn when the right person has loved them long enough. When the sun slid down and the interstate made its quiet, nightly promise to anyone who would listen, she reached up and rested her finger on the small transponder again, not pressing, not hoping, just acknowledging. Out of habit now, out of respect, when the road asked her to hold, she did. Story number 5. Hector picked up the tanker after the wash crew finished their last rinse. The bay was bright as day under steel rafters, the water hissing off the stainless like rain on a roof. In the white glare, the tank looked more sculpture than equipment smooth, domed ends, ladder rungs clean enough to show your face. The operator handed him a clipboard with the neatest boxes he'd seen all week and said, "She's dry. Food grade nice and empty. You'll hear her talk when she cools down." "It's normal." "Talk how?" Hector asked, half smiling. "Pings and pops," the man said, snapping a cap back on a hose coupling. "Little knocks when the metal remembers the night. Don't let it rattle you." Said. Hector nodded. He'd run tankers before. Empty ones had their own private weather expansion, contraction, a math problem you could hear. He signed, did his walk-around, and climbed into the cab. The route would take him east overnight across long, quiet counties, pick up in the morning at a sweetener plant. Cleaner than most. Strict about seals and paperwork. He liked that kind of order. He liked the way the world got simpler, once the hour slid past midnight and the road fell into a hush too big to measure. Out of town, an elevator rose like a concrete ship at anchor, its square windows lit for no one in particular. Moths swarmed the sodium lamps and made pendulum shadows that vanished as he passed. Wind tunneled through the cab's vents, cool and map-scented. He settled his shoulders, set an easy speed, and watched the countryside become a low roll of darkness broken by farmstead lights, each like a far-off porch that would always be out of reach. The first ping came soft, stainless cooled, and made a sound like a coin thinking about falling. Another followed, then another, slow, as if the tank kept count with a gentle finger. He smiled. Normal. The wash bay had been warm, the night had teeth. The tanker made its small, intelligent noises, and the miles wrote themselves forward. He crossed a shallow river that reflected stars like rumors. A wind farm stood beyond it, the red aircraft beacons blinking in patient chorus along the ridge. Under them, the turbines moved like slow thoughts. In the cab, he felt the sub-bass hum slide under the engine's note, a sound too big to be loud, the kind you notice mostly in your teeth. The tank answered with a soft tap-tap, then quiet. Hector listened because there was nothing else to do but listen and keep the line of the lane. He imagined the tank as a big ear, picking up details that the rest of the night ignored. Another sign announced a long stretch with few services. He'd planned for that coffee in a thermos, water, a sandwich wrapped in paper that made a hopeful crinkle. The highway gently rose and fell with the land. The air smelled like cut hay somewhere he could not see. He passed a roadside cross, white and simple, lit by a small solar candle that made a tiny, steadfast star at the ditch. The tank gave 3 small knocks in a row. He eased his hand on the wheel but didn't say anything, not even to the dash. He didn't like to turn patterns into promises too early. A few miles later, a pronghorn stepped into the median, paused, and trotted back the way it had come, as if thinking better of a plan. The tanker pinged twice quick, like a hiccup. Nothing else happened. The road exhaled again, and lay flat and polite. He crested a hill and saw the wind farm again, closer now, the towers arranged in a geometry that made sense to someone who had stood in that field with a surveyor's stake and a vision. The red lights blinked. Blink, blink. A heartbeat for machinists. The tanker answered with 3 knocks as he drew level with a maintenance road. He checked his mirrors for a sudden narrowing of lanes, for animals, for anything at all. Dark field, line of towers, fences catching his lights like silver thread. The knocks made a pattern anyway, and once seen, patterns don't like being unseen. The bypass he intended to take branched off a few exits later, a county road improved enough to be proud of, a shortcut past a town that liked to fall asleep inside its courthouse square. He'd run it many times. Tonight, a portable sign on a trailer made a suggestion he hadn't expected. Road work, ahead, local traffic only. He moved right to take a look. Sometimes those signs were left up for days after nothing obvious justified their existence. The tanker gave 3 faint measured taps just as his blinker ticked. He inhaled, held it, and let the truck drift back into the main line. The detour would be dull. The night didn't owe him efficiency. In his mirror, the mouth of the bypass slipped past, dark and unassuming. At the next overpass, an orange work light glowed on the shoulder, and a loader sat with its bucket lowered, sleeping in the way that equipment sleeps available at a moment's decision. He felt oddly relieved in a way that made no practical sense and didn't try to analyze it. On a long, straight run where ranch fences lined up like staff paper and the notes were mesquite and sage, the knocks came again, soft, close, like gentle knuckles on a desk. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. He clicked the radio over to the weather band. Let the distant, calm voice talk about wind at angles and a pressure line slipping south. He could have turned the music on. He didn't want human voices right then. He wanted the road to finish a thought. He met a pair of eyes at the edge of the shoulder, a coyote, respectably lean, sitting as if an audience member at a small theater. The animal watched the truck pass and did not move. In the mirror, it lifted its head, as if sniffing something that wasn't there, and then was just another small detail given back to the dark. A rest area approached like a small promise. He'd fueled earlier. He didn't need much. He wanted to stretch and look at his equipment, because it always felt better to look and find nothing than to not look and wish he had. The place was empty except for a pickup with a long antenna angled from its bed. its driver asleep or pretending to be. The lamps were the newer kind, cool-toned, making the pavement look clean even where it wasn't. A low stone wall held a metal plaque about the prairie, and a picture of bison from the long before. Hector walked the rig, the familiar path steer tires, lug nuts, hubs, tanks, lights. He climbed the ladder on the tanker's rear and laid his palm on the steel. Cool. Clean. He checked the manway clamps dogs. Some people called them their handles folded down, their pins seated. One had a looseness he didn't like. Not unsafe, not open, but not the song he preferred to hear from metal. He took the bar from the holder and gave it a quarter turn, just enough to bring everything into the same sentence. The night seemed to approve. The tanker went quiet. When he climbed down and dropped to the pavement, a small sound carried from the catwalk above one step, maybe two, like someone testing whether the ladder would hold. He looked up. His own reflection eyed him back from the curve of the tank, stretched and tilted. He waited, hand on the ladder, until the silence wrapped back around itself. Cooling, he said aloud, because names help. He stowed the bar and sipped water, and counted to 30 for no reason other than to lengthen the pause. When he rolled out, the knocks didn't resume immediately. He found that he missed them. The next hours draped over him like a coat, the kind of coat you only notice when you don't have it. The cab took on its familiar sleep smell fabric, dust, a faint trail of coffee. The edge of the horizon began its slow, difficult lightening, a gray on black that made the world look like it was remembering outlines. He passed a road that someone had named with an old railroad word. The right-of-way ran parallel to the highway here, darker even than the fields. The tracks had been lifted years ago. The signal heads remained. Iron things on poles. Lenses blind and dusty. As he approached one such signal head, the tanker gave 3 swift taps. The lenses of the dead mast did not light, of course, but in the side window's glass, where reflections play tricks, he saw for a second no longer than a blink, the suggestion of a green lamp turning to red. He slowed, not a lot, just enough to alter the cadence. 58, 56, 55. The knocks stopped. Something without urgency but full of intent moved in the darkness off the shoulder, and cattle emerged in a single, agentless flow, and crossed the highway calmly, securely, like a river taking the shortest path across a flat place. He let them go. He could hear one lowing softly, as if to shepherd somebody else along. Their hide shone dully like wet stone in the early light. He laughed, not loudly enough to startle himself. "Thank you," he told the steering wheel, and felt foolish, and didn't mind. At the county line, a sign with bullet holes older than he was, the wind turned. He could feel the truck square its shoulders against it. The tanker joined in lightly, a tap here, a ping there, not pattern now but commentary. The turbines along the ridge ahead looked closer, simplified by dawn, their blades making great, slow X's against a sky that thought about becoming blue. He imagined the knocks as a language. He imagined he'd learn it by winter, the way a person learns the creaks of a house. He imagined the tank was teaching him, patient and practical, the way a long road teaches a person to stop mistaking attention for superstition. The turnoff for the plant sat 3 miles down a road that followed a creek's old argument with rock. The plant stack blinked in a steady white, and the security booth wore a fluorescent halo. He queued behind 2 other rigs, corn syrup, judging by the placards. The guard, a woman with a braid and a clipboard, and an expression that had seen everything twice, came out into the morning air and lifted a hand that said both wait and welcome. "Empty?" she asked when she reached his open window. "Yes, ma'am." "Nice shine," she said, eyes flicking to the tank. "I can see breakfast in it." Her gaze moved to the manway dogs as if by habit. "Good catch." She pointed lightly with the pen. "That one likes to sulk if you don't sweet-talk it." He smiled. "It told me." She laughed, and it sounded like someone who had also heard steel make up its mind. "Gate'll open. Park in the far lot. They'll get you when they're ready to load." Coffee's better than it smells in the driver room. He pulled forward when the arm lifted and parked, where he could make a straight shot out later. The plant's morning had its own rhythm forklifts with beepers that were not apologetic but still polite, voices bouncing lightly from metal to concrete. He shut down, rolled his shoulders, and looked at the tank again because he could. Dew had formed while he waited, tiny beads joined by invisible maps. Across the domed end, a faint track of dry spots crossed sideways, as if the dew had been wiped by a hand too light to be practical and too careful to be an accident. The pattern looked like boot treads in miniature. He moved closer, breath held without thinking, hand lifted to touch. The sun slid out from behind a piece of cloud, and the dew vanished so fast it looked like someone had made a decision. He didn't mention the dry tracks in the driver room. He didn't need the look people give when you bring up a detail shaped like a story. He took coffee that steamed more than it delivered and sat with it anyway, watching the morning write itself on clipboards and computer screens. A man with a logbook and a 1,000-yard stare offered him half an orange without context. He accepted it. It tasted like a promise you could keep. After the load call and the paperwork, after the hiss and clap of hoses and the slow filling that makes time behave like something stretched, he pulled out of the plant with a different weight, a good, obedient heaviness that made the truck feel like a statement rather than a question. The tank, full now, said almost nothing. It had gone from storyteller to reservoir. The road wore daylight and lost some of its mystery, but not all. On his way back through the first town, he swung past the wash bay to leave a note, "Thanks for the clean," and the warning. On the cinder block wall near the door, a clipboard hung for after-hours drop-offs. A photo was pinned above it, old, a little sun-faded. A man in coveralls with a crooked grin and boots that looked resolute. Above it, somebody had written in marker, "For Cal, who checked around twice." Below, in smaller letters, "Listen for the ping. He'll remind you." The operator from the night before saw Hector standing there and came over with a rag thrown over his shoulder like a pageant sash. "Cal taught half the town how to take a feeling seriously," he said without preface. "Made us all double-check clamps after he caught one half-dogged at 1 a.m, and swore he heard someone walking the catwalk that wasn't there." He shrugged, a gesture that contained both affection and resignation. He passed in the spring. If there's any fairness, he's still making his rounds. Hector looked at the photo, at the boots in it, at the grin that was still busy with something. "Your man said tanks talk when the night cools," he said. "They do," the operator said, "and sometimes the night listens back." It wasn't an explanation. It didn't need to be. Hector left his note because leaving a note is sometimes a way to say the thing you won't say to a person. He climbed back into the cab and pulled onto the street. The day had decided to be warm. The wind had turned considerate. Trucks moved along their routes like parts of a bigger plan no one needed to see all at once. That evening, 100 miles away, he parked at a rest area with a row of picnic tables under cottonwoods planted in a straight military line. He walked the rig at dusk the way he always did. The tanker was silent, full, and satisfied. He reached up and touched cool steel with the flat of his hand, not expecting a reply. Before he drew his hand away, something soft inside the tank expansion, contraction. The metal rethinking its day made a sound almost like a knock. 1, 2, 3. He laughed once, quietly, and went to sleep with the window cracked just enough to let the song of the highway in. In his dreams, red lights blinked on ridges, cattle crossed without hurry, and boots made their polite tap along a catwalk, not demanding anything, only making sure. Story number 6. Noor eased the new tractor out of the distribution yard as a quarter moon climbed a little higher than the light poles. The lot's gravel crackled under her tires, and the empty trailers lined up in rows like quiet boxcars waiting on a siding. Her trailer was a dry van, plain white sides with a stripe that faded in the middle where sun and time had done their work. Inside, pallets of pet food were stacked square and wrapped tight. It was a forgiving load, dense and steady, and she liked the way the truck settled onto its springs when she pulled the air out of the lines and felt everything lean into her. Out on the highway, the night breathed. She let the truck settle at 62, set the adaptive cruise, and watched the dash do its little dance of approval. This tractor was new enough to have opinions. Triangles would glow in the mirrors when something sat in her blind spots. A small icon would trace lane lines with a thin glow when the camera could see. If she drifted, the wheel would nudge, like a polite reminder. She'd learned to turn that part off. She didn't like machines pretending they knew her hands better than she did. But she left the blind spot sensors active. On long nights, they were honest company. The interstate unwound across open range. Fences far apart, cattle where they pleased, gates at intervals that looked like suggestions more than boundaries. The pavement was clean, and the reflectors bright, a firm ribbon through land that kept its own counsel. A sign warned open range for the next 50 miles. Noor nodded at it as if it had asked her something, and then settled her shoulders a little lower. The first ping came 20 minutes later, a soft tone in the left mirror. The small triangle glowed amber in the glass, as if a car sat in the lane beside her. She checked. Nothing. The road held its silence. The triangle stayed lit for 3 beats, and then went dark, a firefly winking out. Crosswind, she said to herself, even though the air didn't make enough fuss to justify it. False positives happen. Metal, wind, guardrails. She eased a breath in and out, and sank into the slow rhythm of mile markers and the easy, low talk of her engine. The triangle came back just before a dip in the road, and then disappeared as the pavement leveled. When she reached the dip, a broad piece of truck tire tread lay in the left wheel track like a black ribbon. The triangle had kept her from gliding left to pass a slower van in front. She'd left more space instead. It would have been nothing to straddle the tread. It would have been something to catch it wrong. She passed the van, let the road take back its slow breathing, and glanced at the mirror as if it had told a joke it didn't want credit for. "Okay," she said softly. "You can be weird if weird works." The desert opened. The sky sat like a dark bowl overhead. A single ranch house shone on a low hill, its porch light steady, the way a boat's lamp looks steady when you're the one moving. Noor took a sip of the coffee she'd promised herself she'd make last until at least 2 a.m. The adaptive cruise kept her distance from a box truck half a mile ahead, breathing her speed in and out like the ocean on its best manners. The triangle lit again. This time both mirrors. Right first, then left. She didn't move. The lane lines glowed on the dash, then flickered, then glowed again, as if the camera couldn't make up its mind about what the paint meant. The triangles stayed on for longer than before, not urgent, just steady. She held center and rode the crest of a shallow swell in the pavement. Up ahead, a thin veil crossed the road from right to left. Dust, not thick, just a sheet drawn across the asphalt by some small argument between wind and dry soil. The triangles went out as she entered the dust. Visibility dropped by a fraction. The dashboard lane lines vanished. The adaptive cruise chirped politely and told her it was disengaging for now. She took control of the speed like a dancer taking the lead back during a complicated tune. The dust lifted. The triangles flicked on and then off once more, in sequence, as if someone had waved from both sides at once, and then sat back down. She made a small mark on the pad she kept at her elbow. 188 dust sheet triangles early. Her notes would be hard to explain to anyone who expected a mechanical nature to remain mechanical. She wrote them anyway. Sometimes handwriting gave a thought the weight it needed without making it heavier than it deserved. A narrow overpass cut the night ahead, low and square, with concrete abutments patched in a paler gray. The rail line beneath it had been quiet on her last 3 runs. Tonight, she heard nothing. She watched the lines, let her eyes choose center points the way you do when you're steady and awake. Just as she reached for the turn signal to slide left around a slow pickup towing something small, the left triangle lit again and held. The right held too. She stayed in the right lane a second longer, checked again. The pickup's trailer was an open utility rig with a sheet of plywood laid across it. The plywood had come loose at one end and flapped in the air, invisible until her headlights caught its edge for a blink. It would have liked to slap. It would have liked to break the air. It didn't. She let the pickup drift a little ahead. The triangles went dark. She passed with space that felt like a blessing. "Fine," she told the mirror, good-natured. "You can ride along. Just don't scold me for singing." Out past the overpass, the land flattened more, as if ironed. A billboard on a skeletal frame told the night no one particular message. Old porcelain letters for a brand that didn't exist anymore clung to the frame at funny angles, bright under her high beams, and then nothing again. The billboard's edges made a shape of a truck for a second in the glass beside her, and the triangle lit left, went dark, lit right, went dark. Noor laughed aloud and surprised herself. The sound light, more release than amusement. She liked the way the road took jokes without argument. The sky had that thin in-between quality when the night is still true, but the morning is sending scouts. Noor cranked the window open 2 inches and let the air press at her knuckles. A sign announced next services 63 miles. She patted her thermos and decided the coffee might stretch. At that moment, the adaptive cruise chirped again, and the dash flashed a message she hadn't seen before. Object ahead slowing. The triangles lit both sides, a matched pair of small suns in the mirrors. She sat up another degree. The beam of her headlights slid across the road like respect. There it was, low and dark, straddling the fog line. A stock trailer sat at the angle of someone who had barely made it to the shoulder. No lights, no triangles, no hazard flash. The ramped rear gate was down, and a thin fog of dust hung around it like breath. She touched the brakes as if they were an instrument tuned to kindness, and let the truck draw down to a careful 30. She put the hazards on for the trucks behind that weren't there yet. As she passed, a horse's eye caught her headlight and glinted, calm and large, in the kind of quiet that means stillness rather than fear. Someone was at the tongue of the trailer, shape bent, unbolting a hitch, or finding one in the dark. They didn't look up. They didn't need to. By the time she cleared the trailer, the triangles went out. The adaptive cruise offered itself again like a helpful friend. She declined it for a few miles, and let her ankle handle the gradient. The highway returned to its earlier promise. Simple, long, forgiving. "You saved me from spooking someone," she said to the dash. She knew how tech sounded in stories bossy or miraculous, never the small, careful thing it mostly is. Tonight, it felt like something else. Tonight, it felt like a quiet warning in the tone of someone who wants you to make up your own mind correctly. She took the next pullout, one of those triangular slices of old road with a gravel bed and a trash can chained to a post. The wind made a dry, almost musical sound in the can's lid chain. She stretched, checked her tires with a practiced toe, and watched the horizon lighten by degrees. A truck rolled by, its cab lights warm, and the driver tapped their hazards twice. She returned it, grateful for the simple language that trucks keep even when everything else changes. Back in the seat, she adjusted the brim of her cap and rolled on. The next 30 miles were all softness, low hummocks, fence lines like the ruled paper of someone's grade school, a windmill that had decided sleep was better than work. The triangle flickered now and then, in ones and twos, as if making notes to itself. Noor found herself matching its mood, less wary now, and more aware. Not jumpy, just tuned like a radio to a station you didn't know you had. Then came the dust. It wasn't a wall, it wasn't dramatic. It started as a faint blur across the shoulder. The kind you ignore unless you've lived where soil can float. 100 yards later it deepened, as if someone had laid a translucent cloth across the lanes. The smell of it was specific and old. Noor dropped 5 miles an hour and gave the wheel the attention you give a sleeping child. Enough. Not too much. The lane lines disappeared. The adaptive cruise bowed out with a tone that had the good grace to be apologetic. The triangles lit both sides and stayed lit. She didn't look to them for direction. She let them be a gentle box around her. The dust thinned and thickened. Shapes emerged and retreated. The guardrail made its presence known the way a bookshelf does in a dark room there, necessary, unforgiving. The triangles didn't flicker. They held, steady as lamps in fog. The urge to move left pressed at her like a suggestion from someone you don't quite trust. She held center. She could feel the truck's mass like a quiet animal listening for her thoughts. From the right, a shape slid into view that was not road and not fence. A service road cut into the mesquite. Parked on it, partly in and partly out of the dust, a grader faced the highway. Blade lifted, cab empty. Safety cones stood near its tires in a thoughtful line that the wind broke and rebuilt at will. Beyond the grader, where the land dipped and rose, something darker than dust moved. It resolved into cattle, 3 first, then 8 more, then too many to count in that breath. They stepped into the right lane without worry. The triangle stayed lit. Then, for one heartbeat, both flared brighter, as if whatever logic lived in them had gotten loud for a moment. Noor brought her speed down to match the moment and let the herd cross in front of her, big shapes with a way of moving that ignored math and followed whatever it is animals follow when they are unhurried. A man stood near the grater, hat down, hand lifted in a motion that had nothing to do with directing traffic and everything to do with saying we're almost done. Thank you for your patience. She nodded because sometimes there's no one to see you nod, and it still feels like recognition. When the last pair of calves trailed across their ears flicking, their legs moving with that slightly surprised energy of new things, the triangles went dark in unison. The dust blew thinner. The lane lines came back into existence, as if proud of themselves. At the next exit, a one-pump station and a small cafe clung to the edge of the service road like a pair of barnacles. She took it. The cafe's sign was hand-painted and allowed that it served coffee all night while not promising miracles. Inside, a man in a safety vest sat at a two-top with a laptop open, and 3 different kinds of reflective tape fanned out like playing cards. He was young enough to look like he hadn't slept since he learned to, old enough to know better. "Roadside radar?" Noor asked, nodding toward the laptop because sometimes questions behave when they imagine they're casual. He made a face that was half pride, half apology. "Installing a pilot system," he said. "Cattle sensors for the open range. You'd think the cows would carry beacons if we asked nicely. They don't." He slid the laptop a fraction in her direction. On the screen, a wireframe of the highway unspooled with little blocks moving where nothing moved. He pointed at a vertical band of static. "Those are the ghost returns off the posts," he said. "We're trying to teach the system that guardrail isn't a truck, that wind isn't a vehicle, that graders aren't monsters." "Ghost returns," she said, tasting the phrase. He nodded. "Old term. Been around since radar had eyebrows. Stuff that looks like something but isn't, except sometimes it is. Low-angle reflections. Side lobes off the antenna. The algorithm jokes have started. Spooky season out there is 12 months. He sipped coffee, as if it had done something to him personally, and he'd forgiven it. She told him, in the language of road people, the shortest version of the triangles and the dust and the stock trailer. He listened in a way that suggested listening was his actual job, and he only did code to justify it. When she finished, he tapped the screen near a string of numbers she didn't need to know and said, "There's a guy who used to work this corridor. Field tech. Good one. He'd tag certain returns for review." He swore some of the ghosts behaved. Not just noise. Patterns that warned. He called them phantoms that want you to live. He smiled a little, embarrassed to have said it aloud. He passed last year. Dropped his wrench and went with the spring thaw. His name still shows up in the metadata sometimes. We're too sentimental to clean it. Noor took that in like a cup of hot water with something sweeter in it than you expect. "I'll take the sentimental version," she said. "It steers safer." On her way back to the truck, the dawn had made up its mind. The eastern edge had gone pale, and the clouds were deciding on colors like people deciding what to wear. The triangles in her mirrors were dark. The lane camera glowed its thin green. She drove on toward the low pass that cut through a short run of hills. Guide signs warned of curves, and a black arrow on yellow made its insistence known. Left, left, left. Noor took it with the patience of someone who's already arrived in the head and is just letting the body catch up. At the crest, the world narrowed for a breath, a truck length where the lanes pinched and the guardrail came close. A pilot car ahead of an oversized load on the opposite side had halted traffic for a moment. The lowboy coming up the hill wore a thing like a ship's ribcage, wide at the knees, reflective tape blinking as it worked. He was over the line by necessity and angle. Noor's triangles lit. She knew there was no one beside her. She knew they weren't for that. She let them be for this instead. A small box of attention. She eased a foot off. The lowboy passed with inches to spare. That felt like a foot, because both drivers did the math and left room for grace. The triangles went out. She didn't love the way her hands shook, not enough to announce it, just enough to remember. By the time the road leveled, the sun had pulled itself past the horizon like someone lifting a heavy window sash. The pet food place sat in a low, sprawling building with a mural of animals painted in colors that read as friendly even from a quarter mile. Noor backed into door 8 with only 2 pull-ups because the world had decided to be cooperative for a minute. The receiver signed the forms with a long pen attached to the counter by a chain that had outlived better pens. "You're the first in," he said. amused at the idea of any race where the prize was paperwork at dawn. Back in the cab, Noor synced the dashcam to her tablet. She didn't watch footage most trips. She did today. She scrolled to the time where the dust had begun and watched the view frame by frame. Overlaid on the video were pale boxes where the sensors had decided the world contained objects. One here, one there, a line along the guardrail. At the moment where the triangles had flared brighter, an extra outline appeared. Ahead of her, left side first, then right. Not square like a sedan or tall like a semi. It was the suggestion of a tractor, old-fashioned in the way old trucks look different cab forward. Squared edges, proportions from a time when designers had different rulers. The outline held for 3 frames and then drifted forward and faded, as if it had changed lanes or had simply decided to stop being counted. A label flickered then, so quick she had to scroll back twice to catch it. L3 Echo Len Test. The font was plain. The meaning was, whatever a person would let it be. Noor sat still with the tablet in her lap, and the morning clinking around the dock like silverware in a quiet diner. She reached over, pulled a strip of tape from the roll she kept for rattles, and wrote one word on it with a marker. Center. She stuck it above the left mirror where only she could see. When the last pallet left the trailer and the dock light clicked off, she pulled into the lot's far corner and slept. The triangles watched the rest of the world doing what it does. The lane camera went blind when she hung the curtain and didn't complain. The truck hummed while it cooled, like a voice in another room telling a story you already knew and liked hearing again. On nights afterward, when the highway thinned and the new truck's little opinions kept her company, Noor stayed generous with her attention and careful with her doubt. When the triangles lit for no reason she could name and then turned out before her eyes found a reason, she let them have their say. Not superstition, just respect for signals, the roads and the ones made by people who had tried to make machines kinder. Sometimes a dust sheet would lift out of a field with no need to explain itself, and the sensors would draw a sketch of a vehicle at her side that wasn't there and then was, in a different way, in time to keep her from forcing an answer out of a question that didn't want one. Sometimes nothing would happen at all, which is the goal most of the time. And somewhere out there, where a service road meets a fence line and a portable coffee maker pretends to be a lighthouse, a field tech with 3 kinds of tape on a table would squint at a screen and say to no one in particular, "Good job, Len," when the metadata tag drifted past again like a signature at the bottom of a page. Story number 7. Ruth ran the night mail between 2 cities that barely spoke to each other, except by highway. The route was quiet, forgiving. It liked a steady hand and a truck that didn't need approval. Her trailer held rolling cages of sorted envelopes and parcels, the kind with a way of chiming softly when the road made a small suggestion. The company had issued her a new ELD a month back. It did what all the others did, counted, warned, nudged, but it had one feature she liked without admitting it. A low-light mode that turned the whole screen a soft amber at midnight, as if the machine knew bedside manners. Out on the plains, the interstate unspooled like ribbon. Fences kept company for a while and then wandered off. A handful of lights gathered around a grain elevator and pretended to be a town. The wind leaned in once, decided she was busy, and stood back. On nights like this, Ruth would set her elbow on the armrest, take a sip of coffee, and feel time open like a long, straight hallway where all the doors were unlocked. At mile 302, there was a rest area everyone called the chapel. No cross, no stained glass. It was a low cinder block building with blue tile and a cottonwood that had decided to grow half sideways before thinking better of it. Drivers liked it because the lot was wide. The vending machine worked more often than not, and the maintenance crew kept the bathrooms done in a way that felt like gratitude. Inside, near the map with the "You Are Here" star worn shiny by 1,000 fingers, sat a wooden box on a small table. On the lid, in uneven letters burned into the wood, were the words, "Driver's Journal, leave it kind." The box held a notebook with a heavy black cover, a single pencil tied to the spiral with twine, and a few old receipts used as bookmarks. No one had put it there, officially. It had simply accumulated authority through use, the way certain chairs in diners pick up regulars. Ruth had signed the journal once before, after a storm had shoved snow into the ditches like rolled rugs. She had written the useful kind of note-slick bridge at 279, sanded by 345. Nothing poetic, nothing anyone would read twice. Tonight she pulled in because she always pulled in here, walk the rig, breathe air that hadn't been pre-warmed by the vents, look at a tree because it could look back or not, and that was its business. The lot was three-quarters empty. A reefer hummed like it had chosen a key and liked it. A flatbed sat under the cottonwood with a tarp wrapped so neatly it could have been a package from a store that still made a ceremony of paper and tape. The chapel's overbright hallway smelled faintly of cleaner and eucalyptus from a dispenser someone had thoughtfully refilled. Ruth washed her hands, drank water, and on the way out, lifted the lid of the box because she was the sort of person who reads the messages taped to the corner of the soda machine. The journal's first page had been filled 2 years ago by a neat hand that printed like a blueprint. After that, it unraveled into different strokes. Block capitals, ballpoint cursive, tidy notes, jokes with more goodwill than punchline. She flipped until the ribbon marked current. A note from an evening run said, Windit Cutoff Mile, 270. Hold the middle. Another. Sheriff running laser. At 314, be nice. Someone had taped a tiny photo of a dog wearing a bandana and wrote under it in careful letters, Coppolat, paid in snacks. Ruth's eye snagged on a line written in pencil that had been pressed hard enough to indent the page below. Check your driver. Side mud flap bracket at mile 219. If it's humming, it's cracked. I don't ask how I know. She made the face a person makes when a coincidence places itself right in front of them and refuses to move. Her bracket had been fine at the yard. She hadn't noticed any song from the mud flaps. But mile 219 was where the asphalt changed color for 10 miles, and things liked to vibrate there. She made a small mark beside the note because she didn't know what else to do with the tiny thread of attention it had tied around her. She walked the rig, checked lugs, looked at the lines and the catwalk. Nothing made a plea. When she bent to unhook the passenger side mud flap where it had tucked itself under, something about the way the bracket sat looked tired, not broken, just as if it had been thinking about excuses. She told herself not to invent trouble, climbed back into the cab, and rolled the truck into the sweet part of the night. The interstate carried her past the mile markers like beads. At 219, the pavement turned a shade deeper, and a low harmonic found the trailer. There it was, a faint hum by her left rear. Nothing you'd call out on the radio, but enough to make the hair behind her ears feel included. She signaled, took the next turn out a long triangle of old road with a rash of gravel and walked back with her flashlight. The bracket had a fissure you wouldn't see in daylight unless you loved bolts. Under the beam, the hairline caught silver. Not a failure yet. Not a story later. She wasn't superstitious, but she was a student of cause and effect. She pulled the small tool roll from the side box and used a spare U-bolt she carried for no reason that made sense until right now. The fix held. The hum left like someone who had decided to be polite. Back on the main line, she almost said thank you. She didn't. She kept the truck pointed at the next town, where the interstate curved around a water tower that had been painted to look like a hot air balloon. The ELD chimed. Her brake window would open in an hour. She drifted into that good, narrow focus that the road rewards. The chapel came again in the return leg, some hours later, when dawn was still a rumor and her coffee had become ambition. She parked under the cottonwood because it had decided shade was its job even at night. Inside, the fluorescent lights had surrendered some of their enthusiasm. She flipped open the journal to add her note about the bracket, the U-bolt, and the exact number of threads showing on the nut. Writing it down felt like folding a sweater and putting it where the next person could find it. The last page had changed since she'd left. There, in a hand not like any of the others, neat but quick, no flourish, sat a sentence. If you're hauling mail and your initials, R. E. Give yourself 7 minuties. Watch the east. Ruth stared. The line flirted with presumption and crossed it. Anyone could guess her load. The trailer wore the livery. The initials, well, she supposed she wasn't the only RE, steering an overnight, but the coincidence electric fenced the moment. She checked her watch. 7 minutes longer would make no difference to her schedule. She could spare half an hour and still put the truck at the dock, with time enough to complement the forklift. She set a timer because timers made ambiguous choices feel like policies, and took her coffee outside. The air had cooled in a way that made its own sense. Dawn collected itself low on the horizon but hadn't chosen a color yet. At minute 6, out beyond the rest area, east where the highway ran like a plank laid on sawhorses, Lights rose that weren't headlights. They moved in a line too steady to be free, too measured to be accident. 1, 2, 3, as if counted into existence. Ruth put her cup on the bench without looking away. The line touched the interstate where a county road crossed no bridge, just a grade crossing for the spur line that served a silo farther north. The train moved through the intersection at a speed that had been agreed upon by people she would never meet. If she'd left when she meant to, if she'd taken the merge with her usual neatness, she would have met the crossing gates on the downward swing, and the kind of bad luck that makes stories for the wrong reasons. Ruth felt the odd sensation of standing inside a pause that had been made for her. She went inside and wrote in the journal, without thinking too much about verbs. Waited 7. Saw a train where I didn't expect one. Thank you, anyone who told me. She signed her initials in print, like a person who'd already been found out. On the road, the day arrived proper. The sky was done with guessing. The mail rode quiet. She found herself looking forward to the next time the chapel would fall inside her window. It didn't happen every night. Traffic, time, weather, all have agendas. But weeks later, in a stretch where the wind played a weathered fence like strings, she pulled in again and found the box as she had left it. The pencil had been sharpened with a pocket knife that knew the right angle. She flipped pages. Notes had multiplied. Some were simple acts of decency. Car with no lights, at 331, gentle horn helped. Some were the kind of humor that keeps a person alive. Free pie on Tuesday if you say you haul carrots. Some made the corner of her eye prickle. Caution for the solo driver, who likes 2 amperes. M podcasts, call your grandma instead. That one had a tiny drawing of a phone. Ruth was halfway through a page when she caught her own handwriting 2 pages back where she knew she hadn't written. The words were hers voice, rhythm, but the date was a week earlier than her last trip, and the note was specific about something that hadn't happened until 2 nights ago. She traced the letters with a finger, as if they belonged to someone else. Her brain made a list and checked it twice. Had she stopped here and forgotten? Had she drunk coffee too quickly? Had someone copied her hand? The world offered no answer, only the same humming of the building's vent. She closed the book gently and went back to the truck. On the passenger seat, her paper notebook, the one she kept for odd bits of necessary nonsense, held a list she'd written after the last run. At the bottom was a line she didn't remember writing. If fog sits in the river cut, take the old road. Left lane holds water. Down 2 lines. Stop before the bridge and count 5. Fog did not sit in the river cut often. When it did, motorists usually announced it with hazard lights, tweets, group texts, messages on signs that offered caution in a font that never quite convinced anyone. She drove on, tuned to an expectation without letting it decide for her. At the cut, the day had turned milk glass. Already, taillights appeared as red beads and vanished. She signaled and moved into the right, reading the subtleties in the cloud as if it were a letter. The left lane, low as a bad mood, gleamed darker. Water likes a place to be. The old road branched off as a maintenance route with a sign that asked her not to. It slipped along a higher contour, narrow but honest, rejoining the interstate past the bridge. She took it because sometimes the sign is for someone else. When she reached the bridge's far end, the fog thinned enough to show the left lane holding a long, shallow sheet of water. Nothing dramatic. Nothing people would notice until they were standing beside their vehicle wishing the angle were different. She stopped on the shoulder and did what the note in her book had told her to do. She counted 5. While she counted, a pickup towing a boat eased by at a careful speed. The driver tapped a thank you with his hazards. Ruth lifted a hand. She did not bother with the arithmetic of why she had done the things she'd done. She wrote the detail down as soon as the pen would agree to be uncapped. She began to treat the chapel the way people treat certain benches, certain clocks, certain doors with worn handles. She did not rely on it. She did not ask it for things. She did not look for verbs like promise or swear. But when the route's breath lined up with hers and she found the blue tile and the cottonwood again, she lifted the lid and read. Sometimes the entries had edges that made her laugh. Left lane has a personality after 290. Sometimes they were practical in ways the official channels never learned to be. Trailer tails at 411 have a habit of opening themselves. Tap them when you walk by. And sometimes the journal was quiet entirely, unavailable except for a page that said, check tires, check tires, check tires, like someone practicing letters. On those nights, Ruth would walk her rig with particular attention to the inside rear on the driver's side because that one liked to make unannounced plans. Once, late, the box held not the journal, but a plain envelope taped to the inside of the lid with blue painter's tape. Driver, who runs mail southbound after midnight, the envelope said in block letters. Inside was a page torn from a calendar, with 3 tidy bullet points. Brake check area at 257 has gravel swept. Don't trust the edge. Someone's walking a dog at 243 who thinks leashes are suggestions. If you feel the wind change near 229, it's because of the canyon. Don't fight it. Let the truck do the work. Underneath, in smaller writing, as if after a second thought, you know this. We're just reminding each other. Ruth stuck the note under the rubber band on her visor and smiled at the we. She liked how the world changed when a person decided to include themselves. Months into the habit, she met a maintenance worker at the chapel when the son had just enough energy to be unkind. He wrung out a mop with professional respect and nodded at the box. That thing keeps the place company, he said. Folks drive nicer after they write. They throw their cups away instead of feeding the parking lot. Who keeps the key? Ruth asked. He looked at her like she'd asked which way the wind planned to blow. Hasn't needed one. We put the box out a few winters ago after the old coffee machine died. Started as a parts bin. Somebody slipped a notebook into it. Been there ever since. The pencil tries to leave now and then. It always finds its way home. We sharpen it. It thanks us by making that scratching sound that makes the building feel less like a box and more like a room. She asked him if anyone had ever taken the journal home. Couple of folks have tried, he said, not accusatory. Just in the way of recounting how weather happens. They get to the county line and turn around. There was no reason for that to sound like anything but a joke. It didn't sound like a joke at all. On a summer night that felt more like a warm breath than air, Ruth found a page with a list of names and cities, like a guest book at a wedding where all the guests were busy and happy to be alone together. She added her initials after a half dozen that didn't look like hers. On impulse, she turned the page back and found dates. A year old, 2 years, 10. Her initials appeared once in a looped hand that wasn't hers, beside a date from the year she'd first canned peaches in her kitchen and sworn off stick shifts until she changed her mind. It wasn't a trick anyone she knew could pull. It wasn't something she planned to bring up in a room with fluorescent lights. She followed the advice of the strange entries when it asked nothing of her but attention. She stopped for 7 minutes when the page said, "Look east." She held a steady course when a line of ink said the wind is lying at 320. She knocked ice off the mud flaps with the rubber mallet before the mud gave it to her as a gift she didn't want. In return, she left notes in the same tone, no drama, no heroics, just lines like, "Remember the slow vehicle lane is full of nails after storm cleanup. No good deed, etc." The journal tended to repeat the useful phrases. She began to recognize her own words, coming back to her like a radio station picked up 2 states away. It wasn't all warnings and relief. Once, a page simply read, "Look left at 267. High bank. Past the trees." When she did, on a night when clouds had drawn a ceiling just low enough to matter, she saw a meteor scribble. A perfect, ridiculous signature above the ridge, and burn out like a sparkler's tired cousin. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Another time, a page said, "If the vending machine eats your dollar, hit B7 twice. It knows you now." She rolled her eyes at the idea, and did it anyway. The machine gave her a bottle of water and a bag of pretzels for $1, as if the building itself had decided to reimburse her for something. Later, in the city at the end of her route, unloading done and the cages pushed into a cavernous sorting room that smelled like paper and work, Ruth stopped by the small break space where drivers who ran the night turned into people who could nod politely in daylight. A younger driver she'd spoken to twice sat with a map crumpled under his hand. "You run 302? He asked without preamble. "I do." "You read the book?" "I do." He hesitated, then said in a voice that wanted to behave, "My aunt wrote in it once. Before I had my CDL. She ran doubles. Swore that thing saved her from forgetting to check a pin that she never forgot. She's got awful penmanship." I found a note from her on a page from last winter, signed with a loop like she makes on her A, dated 2 years before she wrote it. She said that was just the chapel doing what it does. He shrugged, and a kind of gentleness moved through his shoulders. I don't try to explain it anymore. I just put the pencil back when I'm done. When the leaves of the cottonwood turned a tired yellow and let themselves go, Ruth pulled into the chapel and found that someone had placed a small lamp on the journal's table. A little push-button battery light, the kind sold in 3-packs in aisle 9. The light made a circle of warmth on the paper. Tucked under the twine that held the pencil was a postcard of the rest area in daylight. The cottonwood leaning wrong and right. On the back, someone had written, "If you're tired, sit. If you're lonely, write. If you're scared, say so, and we'll tell you what we can about the wind and the mile markers." Ruth Saturday. She wasn't scared. She wasn't lonely exactly. She was the kind of tired that comes with being good at something for a long time. She wrote a line she didn't expect to write. I'm R.E. Thank you for the 7 minutes. I'll pay them forward. She tucked the pencil back under the twine. The pencil made a small, precise tick as it settled. It might have been nothing. It might have been the box acknowledging her, the way a dog lifts its head when someone comes home. On the road after, when the interstate ran true, and her trailer sang its small metal song, Ruth glanced at the visor where she'd pinned the blue-taped list months back. The words had faded a little. They still told the truth. She started a new list on a fresh strip of tape. Check, bracket, at 219. Watch for train if someone says so. Never ignore a look east. On a day when she retired from running that route and took a different one, because the company's needs had shuffled like cards, she stopped one last time at the chapel with a bag of decent coffee and a packet of new pencils. She laid them in the box under the notebook and wrote the only thing that felt right. Be kind. Leave what you know. Take what you need. The words didn't glow. The journal didn't change shape. The cottonwood didn't lean any more or less than it already had. But the building held the sound a paper makes when it turns, and for a moment the rest area felt crowded in a good way, as if all the small, careful notes people had left for each other made a room that could be visited whenever the highway grew long. Story number 8. Cal had never taken the river ferry at night. The map showed it as a short diagonal between highways, a steel rectangle that slid from one gravel ramp to another, while the current thought its own thoughts. By day, the crossing was a novelty tourists with cameras, motorbikes lined up like punctuation. He reached it after midnight with a load of palletized tile, dense and tidy, his trailer heavy in a way that made the tractor feel grounded. The approach road dropped gently toward water, turned black by the hour. Fog lay in low stretches like smoke that had decided to rest. A string of lamps along the ramp made islands of light, and beyond them, the ferry sat against its landing, a flat deck with short railings, a small pilot house like a hat perched at one corner. The gate was up. A sign in reflective letters asked for low gear, no sudden accelerations, park brake set. Another sign, older and less official, had been screwed crooked to a post. No heroics. Listen to crew. Cal rolled down the window. The river had a smell metal and damp earth, and a little sweetness from somewhere upstream. A deckhand stepped out of the shadow. High-vis vest turned ghostly in the mist. He lifted a gloved hand and gave the universal roll forward gesture. His voice carried in that odd way night voices do. Come on up, front left, nose to the chalk. Chalk arrows and lines marked the deck where tires were meant to kiss, worn to soft ghosts, and refreshed so many times that past instructions overlapped, like conversations. Cal eased on, felt steel under rubber, and took the turn at the deckhand's palm. The ferry gave a slow sigh against its chains as if adjusting its posture. He set the brake where told, nose to the chalk, left front to a faded X that someone had once drawn with conviction. The deckhand walked past with a glance at the placards and a nod he didn't bother to translate. Tile? He said. Tile. Cal agreed. Good weight. Doesn't argue. The man gave an approving tap to the trailer's side and moved to wave on the next rig a tanker, whose driver flicked a cigarette out into the fog and thought better of it, retrieving it with a guilty little dance. Engines off, a voice called from the pilot house. We'll be underway in a minute. The voice was calm and practiced. and it made the river sound like a hallway everyone shared. Cal stretched his fingers and let his shoulders loosen. The quiet that fell when Diesel gave up its song made the night feel larger. He could hear the water lick politely at the ferry's flanks, the soft contact of tires against steel, the creak and settle of equipment finding its evening shape. Somewhere near the bulkhead, metal touched metal and made a note like a spoon against a jar. A bell rang. It wasn't the ferry's horn. It was a small, round sound, older than the paint, clear as glass tapped with a ring. One short. Two short. One long. It didn't repeat. It was not part of any procedure he'd been told. He looked toward the pilot house. The deckhand didn't react. The pilot stepped to a lever and worked it like a familiar phrase. Chains woke. Water gathered its mind, and the ferry eased away, making a slice of flat in the moving river. Cal told himself he'd heard Dock Hardware complain that the bell-like tone had been coincidence and acoustics. The night didn't argue back. It just kept its own counsel and moved. The ferry angled upstream. Ferry math. Aim your nose into what wants to push you aside. Cal felt the faint sway under his boots. The particular rhythm of a flat deck, finding harmony with current. The lights on the far bank were fewer farmhouse, a corrugated shed, a sign that named the county in a font that belonged to courthouse letterheads. A step sounded on the deck behind his cab. A single footfall, measured, not quite in boots, not quite in shoes, soft enough to be wind, specific enough to make wind an unsatisfying answer. Cal checked his mirror and saw only the tanker's gleam and a hint of the reefer behind it. The deckhand was at the bow, rope in hand, watching the river's texture as if reading it line by line. The bell rang again. One short, two short, one long. Then, after a pause, one short. The pattern dug a little hook into his brain, the way a song does when you don't know the words but you know how they go. He leaned forward and saw that just ahead of his bumper, a wheel chalk sat on the deck, painted yellow once, and now a soft suggestion of that color. Another lay 2 feet to the left, not doing much. He stepped down, felt the deck give a tiny breath under his weight, and without thinking too hard, moved the second chalk into place against his front tire. He put his hand on the tire, as if to tell it a secret, and climbed back in. The deckhand glanced over and lifted his chin, the smallest acknowledgement. The pilot worked the lever another degree. The ferry cut a slightly steeper line. Halfway across, the current changed its mind. He could feel it, the way one feels an elevator stop before it stops. The river bunched at the bow and tried to climb. The ferry answered with a roll nothing dramatic, just a careful lean. The tanker behind him made a sound like a breath. The reefer creaked. Cal's trailer shifted a finger's width and stopped where the chalk asked it to. He heard something else then, not bell, not water. Footfalls above, crossing the narrow catwalk that skirted the pilot house, the clink of a carabiner against a railing, a voice he did not understand saying something in a tone he did. It sounded like mind the second surge. The second surge came. Less than the first, more than none. The deck settled. The river exhaled. He watched the wake of a tug slide out from upstream, wide and slow, not close. A dark shape with working lights the color of lemons and honey. Its waves took time to arrive. Their timing was their trick. Cal ran through the list of reasons a person puts a chalk down. The list had always ended at physics. Tonight it acquired an annex. At the far bank, the ferry pivoted in a way that looked uninterested and was in fact art. The deckhand tossed a loop. The rope took the cleat with that satisfying thump of competence. Cal released his brake when told, rolled forward the 2 feet he was given, and stopped where a chalk bracket suggested. Engines fired in sequence like polite applause. The bell did not ring. On the ramp, gravel crunched under his tires, and the road lifted him out of the river's voice. He felt the sensation a person feels, leaving a room where a conversation had been interesting and unresolved. He pulled into a turnout to check his straps just because he wanted an excuse to stand still and think. The deckhand's footsteps came across the gravel. Up close, the man's face showed the miles this kind of water puts on people, the kind that tally up as competence rather than age. He tipped his chin at Cal's front wheel. "Good habit," he said. "We don't require chalks on quiet nights. Helps when the river decides to have a thought." "Heard a bell," Cal said, and tasted the words for their silliness. The deckhand's mouth made a quick, surprised smile and hit it. "We took the bell down last winter. Old code. We use radios now, if the horn's sleeping." He gestured toward the pilot house, where a square bracket held nothing. There was a circle on the wall behind it the color of old brass had once covered. "Some nights the river keeps time anyway." "Old code?" Cal asked, careful. Bell used to mean weights and lines, back before the new markers. One short to wake the dock, two to mind the angle, one long for wake on the way, or so they say. Hale used it deck lead. Knew the river like a person knows a road they've walked since feet were new. "We lost him in the spring." The deckhand's eyes were kind, even with that news in them. "Not dramatic. Just time. I guess. He'd have liked your chalk." Cal nodded, because the topic had been as close as it could get and wanted a bow. He thanked the man and took the small climb up into the hills with a steadiness that made the steering wheel feel lighter. The route beyond was spare pasture rising into darker pasture, a stand of trees that collected fog like cloth, a mailbox shaped like a fish. The tile hummed like conversation behind him. He thought about a bell that wasn't there, and the feeling of footsteps above his cab when no one had reason to cross. He thought about the phrase, "mind the second surge," and how someone once decided those exact words were the right ones. On the return trip, dawn had peeled a shade of gray off the river. The ferry was busier, 3 rigs, a couple of cars, a man in a reflective jacket who held a carton of coffee like a votive. Cal pulled up, and the pilot waved him to the stern this time. The chalk lines told their history. Cal set his brake and looked for the yellow chalks. One lay near a coil of rope like a dog. He stepped down, set it against his rear tire, and stepped back up. A bell rang in his head whether or not it rang in the air. An older woman in an office parka and boots stood near the pilot house, coffee carton balanced in one hand, a stack of paper cups in the other. She was the sort of person who runs a place without telling it she does. "You took the night," she said as he passed her eyes. "You made it. Good. Felt like someone helped," he said, the words escaping easier than expected. "Hale helped a lot of people," she said. She set the coffee on a flat surface that wanted to be a table. Some of them knew it at the time. The river lifted then, just enough to make them both spread their feet like dancers. She looked out at the line the current drew, and nodded to it like it had greeted her by name. "If you hear that bell," she added, not looking at him now, "listen, we wouldn't mind if you did." On the far bank, he left a pair of new rubber chalks on a coil of rope, yellow and cheap but sturdy, with thanks written on them in marker that might last or not depending on the weather. He didn't point them out. He didn't need to. The deckhand found them with a lift of the eyebrows that wasn't quite surprise, and wasn't quite the opposite. Weeks later, on a long detour that had nothing to do with the river, Cal stopped at a diner that smelled like pancakes had just learned their destiny. Above the counter hung a photo in a simple frame. A man in a vest and knit cap, grin easy, bell rope in one hand. Someone had written, "1 short, 2, 1 long" in neat letters at the mat's edge, and beneath, "Hale, who counted what mattered." Cal took his coffee to go. The road out of the parking lot met the highway at an odd angle that had always been annoying. Today he waited for one extra breath he could not explain. A pickup rolled through a little too eager from his blind right. Cal would have caught it otherwise, but it felt better to have not needed to. He flipped his wipers once for no reason at all, and laughed quietly at himself in a way that felt like good company. He took the ferry a handful of times after that. Sometimes the night was just a black sheet folded under the deck, uneventful and exact. Sometimes the river knocked 3 notes against the hull when the tug went by. Sometimes nothing happened at all, which is one of the things people are trying to buy when they buy a ferry ticket. But he never stood on that steel without setting at least one chalk. He never pulled on without a glance toward the pilot house where a square bracket held an absence shaped like a bell. He never crossed without listening, not for drama, not for stories, but for the small signals that are not magic so much as attention. And sometimes, when fog sat just so and lights on the far bank made rows of stars in the water, a soft step moved along the catwalk overhead, and the deck shifted in easy timing, and the river felt, briefly, like a place you could learn by ear. And so the last mile fades, and these 8 disturbing trucker stories drift into silence like headlights swallowed by the dark. The road never truly ends, and its echoes follow long after the night has closed. Thank you for traveling with me until the very last word. If you'd like more nights like this, be sure to subscribe so you never miss what lingers in the dark. And like our video, your like motivates us to keep bringing you stories that stay with you long after the road grows quiet. For now, rest easy. Let the night settle around you, and sleep well. Good night.